Welcome to Film Class, where our heads could do with filling with some interesting stuff. Well, now they're bare and full of air, dead flies, and bits of fluff, which is from the Hogwarts, Hoggy Hoggy Hogwarts song that we see the Hogwarts kids singing in this episode. And I actually really like that little moment because I feel like it's very embarrassing in a very British way, in the way that we always tend to embarrass ourselves around people from other countries, where like we think we're being really funny, and like the French kids and the other European kids are just looking at the Hogwarts kids like, what are they doing? Which I just feel like really summarizes where we're at in Britain in 2020. But we have another guest today. Elle, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I like that song as well. I was listening to it today. I'm Ellie. I actually teach, I'm still at the Eternal NQT. I teach science in a school in Kent, secondary science. And yeah, that's it.
She's not giving herself enough credit there. She is single-handedly the funniest Twitter person I have ever followed. And she is GIF queen. And that is a crown that no one has been able to take from her.
I'm wearing my crown now. Let me adjust it just slightly. Thank you.
Today, Elle is with us to discuss fourth film now, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, or an alternative title I prefer is Harry Potter and the Epidemic of Bad Hair, because what is going on with everybody's hair in this film?
Maybe they were in lockdown, so they needed a lockdown haircut.
Yeah, do you know what? That's actually such a good analogy. They all look a bit like, I feel like everyone looked in like June of 2020, where everyone had about a good solid 3 months without the barbers. And it seems like it seems like a trend in Hogwarts this year is everyone to just ineptly grow their hair out, which to be fair is very relatable. Like I remember having some very dodgy hairstyles around this age, because it's like year 10, isn't it? But this is a very exciting year because it's the year of the Tri-Wizard tournament. And this is where we actually get to know a little bit more about the kind of wizarding world more generally. I found this book so exciting when I was a kid. The idea you get to see the World Cup and you get to see the school in France and you get to see other schools. Shay, let's start with you. How do you feel about Goblet of Fire in the kind of Harry Potter universe as a book? Are you a fan?
Book 4 for me is a really special book. There isn't any demon fighting. There isn't any following around Voldemort. And in fact, I don't think his name's mentioned until quite near the end, after the last challenge and he presents himself, even though he's blatantly prevalent in everything that's been going on throughout the Triwizard tournament, you later find out. But for me, there's so many things that are just so normal for kids to be experiencing throughout the film. The fact that, you know, both Harry and Ron are just trying to work out girls and trying to figure out the best way to approach them, to ask them to the Yule Ball, you know, what they're wearing to the ball, all of those things, they just felt so normal and so real. You kind of stepped away from the magical world and you felt like they were in the real world with you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like this is where a lot of people actually don't like this book because there is so much of the like teen angst, like teen romance stuff. But that feels like a natural progression to me. You know, they are getting to that age now where they're starting to notice each other. I think there's a really interesting choice that's made in this film because in the book, Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, you get the sense that they are like Hogwarts for both girls and boys, but they made the choice to make Beauxbatons like a girls' school and Durmstrang a boys' school. And that whole sequence where they come to Hogwarts, I feel like you could write a whole like thesis on like gender representation in just that, like those like 2 minutes of like the Beauxbatons girls coming in and like fluttering around and they're so like hyper feminine, and then the Durmstrang lads like banging their literal like phallic objects and like jumping about and somersaulting. But actually, before we kind of talk about those schools in a bit more detail, it's very important now that we find out which Hogwarts house would you be in and why would you be in that house?
I'm a Gryffindor. I've always been a Gryffindor. Strangely enough, it doesn't change. Even if I try again, I'm still a Gryffindor. So, yeah, obviously, best house. I'm biased, of course. I would have done amazing things in Slytherin, just be a bit like Harry, but I'm a Gryffindor through and through.
What is it? You tend to find like, I always get Hufflepuff. And you tend to find people who get sorted into Hufflepuff are very like apologetic, like, oh yeah, I know we're not the best house, but that's whereas Gryffindor, people are always just like, I'm obviously a Gryffindor. It's not a matter of doubt. Like, we are the best house. Like, what is it about Gryffindor that speaks to you?
I mean, I feel for Hufflepuffs. Bless them. They're not very much mentioned, actually. It's like Gryffindor v Slytherin and then Ravenclaw thrown in every so often, just to remind us that there's 4 houses.
You're right. Hufflepuff is definitely underrated. I guess this is the only film actually where the film ends with the Hufflepuff flag at the very end, doesn't it? But for a very sad reason, because it's because of Cedric Diggory's death. But just to go back to Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, then I mean, I'm very intrigued by this idea of like different magical schools. Elle, would you, let's say you had an option, okay? You could do an exchange year where you could either go to Beauxbatons or you could go to Durmstrang. And let's imagine this is the book versions where they're not like single gender schools. Which one would you want to go to?
Victor, hello? He's the best seeker in the world. I think that the problem I've got with when they arrive, there's this stereotyping a little bit, which JK's been criticised for a long time ago when she put the books out originally, and I'm a Victor Crumb lass, so I would have to go all the way to Bulgaria and just I mean, what do they do? Do they bash their batons all the time?
But let's talk about the Triwizard Tournament, because this is yet another example, and we're seeing so many examples of this show, aren't we? Of like how like insanely dangerous absolutely everything they do at Hogwarts is. And it drove me mad when I rewatched this film that once Harry's name comes out of the goblet, that they're just like, well, there's no other choice here. He'll just have to do the tournament. Like, why on earth? Again, McGonagall, I'm just saying, is the voice of reason. It's just like, well, can't we just not have Harry do the tournament? And they're all like, no. We've got to be a stickler for rules. Like, they are all being such jobs worse, I feel like, about this. They could literally just have been like, we've already got a Hogwarts champion. Like, we don't actually need to follow the rules to the letter. And I think that flags up that actually, like, it's sometimes people get really obsessed, especially in schools, with like, we've got to stick to the rules and we've got to do it exactly to the letter and to the book. When actually I feel like McGonagall is on the right lines here. I feel like they should have let Harry off and not put him in such a dangerous situation. Shane, given that you are McGonagall's critic throughout these podcasts, do you think McGonagall made the right decision here?
As someone who's a stickler for the rules, I would have let him carry on.
Oh my God.
No, I wouldn't. Of course I wouldn't. I wanted to see how you'd respond. No, I think she was absolutely right. There was a reason why the age restrictions were put in place there. The games that were coming up, they did need a certain level of wizardry skills. And we later on find out that even Cedric Diggory didn't work out some of the moves that needed to be made. Barty Crouch, who was at the time, impersonating Mad-Eye Moody, he dropped hints and told him where to find the information and all of those kind of things. So most certainly the age restrictions were there because they needed a certain level of skills in wizardry to be able to complete them. And McGonagall latched onto that, and she was, insistent that he shouldn't do it. It wouldn't have been the episode that it was if they said to him, no, Harry, you were not partaking. It would have been, there we go, Goblet of Fire has ended.
Harry would have found some way to get himself involved, let's be honest, which, I mean, I'm sounding like Ron at this point, but this is also quite an interesting one in that we start to see the cracks, don't we? Because of Harry getting put in, we start to see that Ron actually has become quite resentful of his best mate, and he gets a little bit annoyed with him. Probably a good thing that they don't seem to have any social media in Hogwarts, because I feel like this situation could have got even uglier had they all had little WhatsApp groups, or I mean, I believe I'm right in saying the film's set in the early 90s, aren't they? So these were the halcyon days where actually their beef is just resolved in person, isn't it? But do we feel like Ron is justified here in his kind of resentment of Harry? Because although the film shows that actually he's wrong, obviously Harry did not put his own name in, it feels like this has been building for quite some time, doesn't it?
I think that at this point, Harry Potter, the boy who lived, is all famous. Everyone is like, even the adults, they're like, whenever they meet him, they're like, oh, it's Harry Potter. It's such a pleasure to meet you. Then I'm not surprised that Ron would go and think that he's done it on purpose to attract attention. You end up doing that, right? A little bit. If you think about it, if you're the best mate of the most popular girl or the most popular guy in school, and they always get the attention, and they do even more to get the attention, you might get to a point where you're resentful, I think.
I think the problem is their friendship is unequal, isn't it? Like, Hermione is at least like Harry's equal. Like, she's by far the most intelligent one. She's really good at school. They really need her. Whereas I think the problem here is Ron doesn't know like what his role is. He doesn't really get what his function is in this friendship. And so this is another example where he actually feels like Harry's kind of like cut him out and not really informed of what's going on. And he's being unfair, but you can see the background. But I think it flags up like how intense friendships can be at this age, like how you can like switch from just like, they spend every moment together and then suddenly just don't speak to each other at all, which I feel like is quite rare as an adult, but happens all the time when you're this age.
It's actually quite lucky. You mentioned social media, Sean, and I think he's quite lucky that social media doesn't appear at Hogwarts at all, whether he was there or not. I mean, obviously, by the time the books were written, he wouldn't have been there that much, but not like today. It's one of those things where it's this he said, she said, and then she said, but then back and forth in a ping pong game of the friendships break up and then you can't sit them together in class because otherwise it gets worse, and etc. And then the next day they're best friends again, and gosh, it's a roller coaster ride. I don't know how they do it, honestly.
Yeah, and then the parents call in and then let the head of year know, and then you get the email saying, please don't sit X next to Y.
Yeah.
And then the next thing you see is X and Y skipping out the classroom hand in hand, and you're like,
Yeah.
why did we get the email then?
In 24 hours, it's like the whole world goes upside down and then returns to its upright position. It's quite intense. I don't know, it must be intense for them as well. But to see it happen is quite, it's quite a learning curve.
Mad-Eye Moody. So let's talk about him, because I guess we have to bear in mind, based on what we know at the end of the film, that we never actually really meet that character. We meet someone impersonating him, but we do see Barty Crouch's version of Mad-Eye teaching. Elle, what did you think of Mad-Eye's lessons?
Safeguarding, hello. I mean, this is like throughout, obviously, but him just torturing that poor animal, even though obviously we don't know Mad-Eye Moody as a character. But it's clear that this particular guy in charge of, the defense against the dark arts is not possibly the best choice ever made so far. That's a controversial post that clearly no one wants it, and the ones that get it, are a bit off the charts one way or another. So you can see it on everyone's face, but Hermione is the one that, stop, don't you see it's bothering him? And he comes out of a reverie while he's doing that. It's crazy. No safeguarding whatsoever.
He introduces us to the 3 unforgivable curses, doesn't he? So you have the Imperial curse, where you can torture some, or you can make something do what you want, and you also have the death curse, and I can't remember what the other one is now, the Cruciatus curse, which is very painful. And he says that the ministry thinks kids are too young to know this information, but he disagrees, so he's going to teach them that, which I think raises a kind of interesting question about like there's other topics, isn't there? Certainly in Black History Month, we've had this in our school. There's been a bit of a discussion about, should we be teaching kids, let's say, for example, about the history of the N word and why it is that that's used or where it's come from. There's a lot of debate about what should we be teaching kids in terms of LGBT issues, in terms of like sex education. It kind of flags up like, what can we as teachers do? Because Mad-Eye, or at least the Mad-Eye impersonator, decides that actually he's going to just go ahead and he's just going to teach what he thinks they should know.
The likes of Harry Potter and Hermione and Ron have experienced a significant amount in the magical world that they probably wouldn't have by their age. It kind of seems like it's not really that much of a big issue that they're being exposed to magic that's out of their age range. But in the reality of things within the curriculum, massive discussions about things like you mentioned, LGBT, that, a lot of parents have protested against. I know we've had this issue in Birmingham where certain parents have said, we do not want those kind of things in primary schools for students to be learning about at such a young age.
There's something we can take away from this film, which is that actually it kind of suggests that actually it is a teacher's right and maybe a responsibility to make their own decision here about what's appropriate. So although in Mad-Eye's case, I think we can probably agree it's not appropriate that he's showing kids, how to torture or harm or abuse their power over each other or animals in this case, or insects. At the end of the film, there's a kind of tie-in, isn't there? Because Dumbledore says that, again, the ministry don't want the kids to know that Voldemort's back, but he's not going to lie to them. He thinks he has a responsibility to tell the truth. And it kind of implies that as teachers, we kind of have this political responsibility almost to be honest with kids. I think about this a lot at the moment, especially in terms of like free school meals and that whole debacle that's going on at the moment. You know, I'm reading Christmas Carol with kids, and we're talking about how unequal the Victorian era was, and then literally like we have an almost identical dynamic playing out right now, like in our own political situation. So I feel like the takeaway from this film is that actually it is right and appropriate for teachers to share information with kids that might be controversial, might not be approved by the government, but actually is really important for them to know.
As a career changer, obviously I'm ancient, so I've come to teaching quite old, and I've had careers before, and I teach science. So obviously in teaching science, because I used to be a nurse, I have lots of kind of, shall we call them, real life stories. So I tend to be quite honest and open with the children, especially when we're talking about not scary topics, but things that can be quite intense. You've given an example now with the free school meals and what's going on now at the moment in an appropriate manner. Obviously, I'll often share something that I might have experienced in my work before as a nurse, for example, and link it to what I'm teaching there and then in science. And I think this goes back to the importance of knowing that we have to make what we do in school, we have to make it's real life at the end of the day. That's what I'm trying to get to. And so all of these things that are outside in the world, they come into school one way or another. And the best option that I think, is just be open and honest and willing to answer questions and willing to discuss what's going on in a very kind of constructive and appropriate manner, etc. But I think that's kind of key of what we do as teachers when we are in school, making those choices. A bit like Dumbledore did at the end, saying, Lord Voldemort is back. You need to know that because he's a big deal.
Absolutely, and I guess this will resonate a lot with you, Ellie, with the idea that actually the kids thought that I was the best fitting teacher to be able to explain to them about coronavirus and some of the methods that have been implemented to try and reduce the spread of the virus, and whether I agree with them or not. And the students have been really mature and careful to broach the subject, but it lends itself to the teaching of a lot of the topics that we introduce to the students at Key Stage 3 and 4. So current affairs do lend themselves to teaching my subject, at least, but it's also, you have to tread carefully on the sense that, for example, if I'm teaching about genetic engineering, is it my opinions that I'm teaching them, or is it, the actual scientific facts behind them? And, it's leading them to make their own decisions on whether they agree or disagree with them, to enable them to make their own judgments and their own views on certain things.
I believe I'm right in saying that we are not, I don't know if it's a legal thing, but I've certainly been told quite a few times that we are not supposed to share our political viewpoints with kids or tell them like who we would vote for in the election and stuff. But essentially, Dumbledore and to a certain degree, Mad Eye here, both go against the idea, don't they? They say, okay, here's what the government essentially of our realm says, and I don't agree with that, and I'm going to make that explicit to you. So, and I'm just going to come back to you on that one. What do you think about the idea that teachers shouldn't be sharing their political viewpoints, or where their political kind of opinions lie?
Don't quote me on this, but I'm fairly confident that I've read quite recently, because obviously there's quite a lot of talk of, for example, critical race theory being introduced to an extent in schools. And I think that it was a legal requirement that we remain apolitical in that sense as teachers, as schools. I wouldn't disclose my opinion in that sense. I would disclose what, for example, the pros and cons are. So Che mentioned genetic engineering, and that's an interesting one because obviously there's one side that is all for it and one side that is against it for obvious reasons. And so when I do that, I will present the two sides. And then the children can make as much of an informed decision as they can of where they stand with that. So I think that we should remain impartial, if you like, as teachers. because I think that there's enough out there for us to present an argument for and against.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I'm really glad actually you mentioned that whole topic of like critical race theory, because I think what you're referring to is that recent debate they had in the Commons where I think it was a Conservative MP said that critical race theory, or the idea of that institutional racism exists, is an opinion and therefore should not be taught as a fact in schools, which I vehemently disagree with personally. What that potentially opens that up to is the idea that you have to present the alternative view, which is the far right view, essentially, which is that racism doesn't exist and everything's fine, which I'm not really happy as a teacher to go along with. And I suppose in certain subjects maybe that doesn't come up so much, but certainly in subjects like history and also English, that's something that does come up quite a lot. And I completely understand what you're saying about having to have a balance when it comes to things like your political position. What actually brings me to, this is the film that I guess really is like the most diverse Harry Potter film, in that we have Cho Chang as a love interest, we have Parvati and Padma as love interests. And J.K. Rowling has been quite criticized, hasn't she, for these characters because they're seen as like tokenistic and not really like having much weight or significance. Cho Chang in particular, I believe I'm right in saying there was a whole controversy over her name not being like a realistic or a plausible Chinese name, like being quite stereotypical in itself. But I think the actress who played her got waded into this year with all the controversies around J.K. Rowling. So Shane, I'm going to come to you on this one first. How do you feel about the representation of characters like Parvati, Padma, Cho Chang? Do you think it's actually a good thing that the school has been shown to be somewhat diverse, or do you just think it's just tokenistic stereotyping? What's your feeling?
Yeah, when I read the book, I definitely felt that they were the tokenistic in there for the sake of bringing in. I mean, their names automatically bring up an image of someone who's from Southeast Asia. They're the only ones that she names within any of the other background characters as being Asian. Cho Chang is obviously from the Far East. They definitely felt like they were in there for the sake of it. I would have liked more of a main character being made out of them, a bit more in the forefront, maybe a few other names. I think when you do watch the film in the crowds, the first and the second one, you don't really see it as much, but from the third and the fourth one, when they're at Quidditch games, when they're at the tournaments and Quidditch World Cup, you do start to see more diverse faces appearing in the crowds. So the extras are starting to become a lot more diverse as well. But nowhere near as to what would represent a real life community. I mean, we both grew up in Birmingham, and you can't walk past 5 people without one being diverse from everybody else. So, for me, it didn't feel real when it came to, does it represent me and my community and the kind of upbringing that I had?
Yeah, and I guess it's the fact that those characters are just so kind of insignificant, really. They are kind of window dressing, but I suppose at least in naming them names that are very clearly like not white sounding names, it does force at least a casting of actors who aren't white. Whereas if you look what happened with Lavender in later film, she in the first few films is cast as a black actress, but as soon as she becomes more significant to the plot and in fact a love interest, she gets recast as a white girl. So I guess at the very least, having names that very clearly are not white names forces the filmmakers to place those actors in positions of some kind of prominence, I suppose.
This book was written in the 90s, and the 90s were famously known for silencing any kind of minority group and making it feel like everything was good, that racism didn't exist, sexism didn't exist, homophobia didn't exist, all of these things. We have mentioned it before, but I think this just sums it up, that she wrote this book and she didn't see any holes in the fact that there isn't fair representation of all of those different minority groups within her story, which went on to being this worldwide success.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can also see that spirit of like the 90s, like where post race, where like post inequality, like things kind of get better, blah, blah, blah. You can see all that kind of spirit in the Triwizard tournament itself. I think there's this whole ideal of like cultural exchange of all these schools in Europe, like mixing together and, celebrating this really fun tournament, which actually made me feel really sad watching it again, like post Brexit, that like the film kind of celebrates this idea that we're like members of a European community that is just like dead now because of what's happened, which is just such a shame.
The only thing that really I want to say is that we should always, one way or another, bear in mind that the context in which a story might develop might be completely different from what we know today. And also, she would have written what she knew. So, all of that comes into bearing. We don't, still today, by today's standards, we're not happy with it. That's fine. But we should recognise also that it belongs to a different era.
J.K. Rowling was writing this in the 90s, and she would have been taking on board everything to her at her disposal in that time era. There is a lot of political correctness that gets brought to light on past stuff that we can't change, and we're living in the here and now, and we know a lot more about in the here and now, and it's all about how we move forward. Going back to what you were saying about the Triwizard tournament and bringing in other communities from other schools, it's definitely not something that we celebrate now. But I do think that schools have a lot of challenges on getting their own community right, and having taught in several different state-run schools, it's harder. Whereas when I was younger, competing against other schools in different sports was a big thing, and it's definitely not something that gets celebrated as much now. As much as the PE departments try and hold on to it, it's not as significant as it used to be.
Harry Potter now is often very criticized in part because of J.K. Rowling herself, right? And how a lot of the stuff that she gets up to on social media now. But I feel like there was definitely criticism at the time of characters like Cho Chang and how kind of the various kind of stereotyping that was embedded in them. I think it's just that now more people are exposed to that kind of criticism. And so I think people who've never really heard those ideas before, who never heard critical race theory that Elle mentioned earlier, people, that has been around since the 90s. Like the idea of cultural appropriation was coined like in the early 90s. It's just that, these were quite academic ideas that are now be more so in the mainstream consciousness, I guess. So I think sometimes, particularly like conservative people tend to think like this has just suddenly emerged with Twitter, and like people just complain about nothing nowadays, when actually those criticisms have like always existed. It's just that now more and more people hear them, and it's one of those things, isn't it? Like, I really enjoy Harry Potter. I really enjoy like visiting that world. I really enjoy the books. And I think you can enjoy something and still like criticize it or think critically about it. I do just really want to talk about the Yule Ball, because I do think it really captures like that moment when you're in school and you have like a special occasion like this that everyone gets really, really excited about.
It's actually quite interesting because I was born and raised in Italy, and I did all of my schooling in Italy, and we don't have proms. But it's quite interesting because I know that prom is a big thing over here. And it seemed clear to me from the setup of the movie anyway that the kids didn't know about the Yuletide ball. It was quite a surprise. And when Ron gets the dreaded dress robes, he's not really kind of putting the two things together. But I think it's a really nice snapshot of, with everything that goes in, and the boys don't have girls until the very end, and then Hermione's beautiful and she gets cross with Ron, and then she goes and storms off, and Neville stays until the end, even though he's not the kind of kid that normally stays until the end. So I think it's a lovely snapshot of what sort of like, I suppose, preparation for prom is over here, I guess.
My school never had a prom. They had leavers parties, which was very much like at primary school. It was a barbecue in the playground where we all came after school and we had a barbecue and we played some music and we played some games. And then in secondary school, I didn't actually go to either leavers parties, but it wasn't prom. Now, as a teacher, that's when I also experienced prom for the first time. And I couldn't believe the big ball gowns, the tuxedos, and all the kids who had spent all year telling off for having their shirts untucked, how smart they looked, the shiny shoes when they've been wearing trainers all year. It was just like transformation. I couldn't believe it. But I do feel in the 12 years that I've been teaching, watching prom develop, it has become more and more Americanized, and the kids feel entitled to have one. Whereas when you see it in Harry Potter, it's very much a an incredibly special occasion. It's not obviously something that they're expecting to happen. The whole school's getting involved. I preferred it the Harry Potter way than the way that it actually happens.
Can we also just talk about Ron's robes as well? Because this might be one of my favorite costumes in the entire film. Like, I love to imagine the costume designer just really sitting down and drafting, like, right, what is the most disgusting outfit I can possibly imagine? Just frustrates me because why doesn't he just use magic to restitch it or improve it? Why is he stuck with wearing this horrendous thing? I think one of the things I like about this sequence is it really captures like not only like the excitement of this kind of stuff, but also how excruciating you feel at this age. Like Ron just feels like he wants to die, like wearing this.
The only thing I wanted to add about the Yuletide book, because I absolutely love Goblet of Fire, is, and you're going to be pleased with this because this is a praise to McGonagall. The way that she gets Ron to dance with her because she's proud of the House of Gryffindor because band of bubbling buffoons at some point, she says, and then Fred and George take the mickey out of her, going like, say that fast 5 times, say that fast again 5 times, sort of thing. And it's just the way that she gets involved in it. It's like mother hen teacher. That's a bit like I am when I'm in school. So I just love that bit that she's going to teach them the ropes. I can't quite see Snape doing that for Slytherin. Do you know what I mean? So that's kind of like, that's one of my favorite bits where they're in the hall and she's saying, I'm going to show you what to do.
I quite like the McGonagall scene as well, where they're about to enter the ball and she goes up to Harry and she says, you and Miss Patil need to take your places. And he's like, what for? And she's like, the champions of each school always start off the dance. And he was like, I didn't know that. And she goes, I told you. And he goes, no, you didn't. And she goes, well, you know now. And I just thought the number of times that I've forgotten to give a kid a message, and that's something super important, and it's like, well, you need to go now. Well, you didn't tell me. Well, now you know. Off you go. It just reminded me so many times. Like, how many times as teachers have we just gone, well, now you know. Move along. One thing about Snape, and this is one of the times that I will say that I was disappointed in Snape. When in the end they find out that it was Barty Crouch who was stealing from his supply store, he was with Harry and he just kind of gives him that look as if to say, all right, fine, it wasn't you. I would have openly apologized to the student if I'd accused them of something and it clearly wasn't them. But that was the one moment where I felt a little bit let down by him. But obviously his character and his persona isn't the type to apologize to anyone, let alone to Harry Potter. So, you know what? I'm going to forgive him on that one, Sean. So we can move along from that as well.
I just wanted to say thank you, Al, so much for just flagging up that McGonagall moment because I had also forgotten that had happened. And we've been doing this thing on the podcast where we've kept a running tally of like, for some reason, because I think McGonagall's my favorite teacher, Snape is Shane's favorite teacher. We seem to be pitting them against each other every episode now for some reason. But I think we can all agree then, based on what Al shared with us, what you have also conceded, Shane, that this is definitely a victorious year for McGonagall, bringing us to then, for every episode, we kind of give Hogwarts an overall ranking based on like the Ofsted grading of, do we think the school needs improvement? Do we think it's good? Do we think it's excellent? It's a bit of a difficult one this year because we haven't seen a lot of like teaching really. But Al, based on what we see in this book/film, what do you think you would grade Hogwarts if you were like a magical Ofsted inspector?
Oh, goodness gracious. They need to make a new thingy for Hogwarts this year. No teaching whatsoever. A kid died. Safeguarding out of... I mean, honestly, it's like it's in measures this year. Absolutely. I mean, I'm sorry, but I can't, I can't do it any other way. It needs to be salvaged in some sort of way.
I definitely agree with you, Elle. With everything that's gone on this particular year, they have to be in special measures in a category. We will be monitoring their progress every 6 months from here onwards until significant improvements are seen. Sean, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to go with the group on this one. I think definitely special measures. I think it's concerning that they do not do their duty by Harry and they make him participate in this tournament when it's clearly not only unsafe, but another thing a question that I had was like, why are Beauxbatons and Durmstrang like not complaining more? I mean, I think they do in the books, not so much in the film, that Hogwarts gets 2 champions and they only get 1, which seems kind of unfair. that I think was a complete failure. They should have listened to McGonagall on that one. I agree as well that, I mean, the Triwizard Tournament itself is incredibly dangerous, but they essentially not only led to a student's death, but then it seems like a kind of, other than Dumbledore, implicated in the cover-up of that death, some of the stuff perhaps. But yeah, I agree. Special measures. I think there's definitely some serious concerns this year. Also, the fact that Mad-Eye Moody is allowed to teach those like very disturbing lessons, re-traumatizing Neville about how his parents were tortured by Death Eaters, like not cool at all. No one flagging up that Mad-Eye had that chest with the real Mad-Eye in it. Like the fact that that slipped past Dumbledore's attention is pretty incredible to me. So I think we can conclude this was not a great year for Hogwarts in terms of its standards. But just the last question I wanted to ask you, before we do finish, I'm just very curious. We have been asking everyone. We've asked you your house, but if you were a teacher at Hogwarts, what subject would you want to teach? And
You can't have potions. I'm already teaching it.
Isn't it obvious? It's got to be Defense Against the Dark Arts, isn't it? That post is cursed. I can just about see it. I go in as an NQT and I fail miserably, and then I have to pack my bags. Honestly, I'd love it just because of Lupin. I think I'd love it just because of Lupin. He was doing a good job, and then those things went through, whatever. Yeah, I'm your next Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher.
I love that. I agree with you. I think that is definitely the position that I would want as well. And I'm glad we're all on the same page that we all think Lupin's a great teacher. Al, thank you so much for joining us today. Where are people able to find you?
Oh, I'll be doing my gifology. I've got a PhD in gifology over at Twitter. My handle is I'll write it down. Thank you so much. This has been so much fun.
Cheers, Al. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And join us next week where we'll be looking at the Order of the Phoenix. Bye. Thank you for listening to us today. Follow us on social media. We're on Twitter at FilmClassPod and also on Instagram on the same handle.
Also, you can send us an email at filmclasspod@gmail.com. Send us over any comments, any suggestions. Thank you so much as well to Kevin McLeod for our music, Night in Venice. You can find all of Kevin's work at incompetech.filmmusic.io, and the license is at Creative Commons.
See you next week.
See ya.